Good morning, everybody. Let's bring it together. We'll try our best to bring it together. Good morning. I know y'all get excited when you're all hanging out with one another. I don't blame you. um, so I want us to go ahead and we'll jump right into it because it is actually a little bit after 10 o'clock and this is not a short program. So I got to make sure that we cover what we can cover in the time that we have. But the landscape design program, of course, sorry, I want to introduce myself. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Taylor Clem. I am the Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator and the Horticulture Extension Agent with IFAS Extension, Nassau County. And hello, everybody that's on our webinar. I know we originally had landscape tools scheduled today, but we had to do that schedule change, and we're doing it today. We're doing landscape design this week, and the landscape tools is going to be next month. But anyways, everybody that's online, feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box. I'm monitoring throughout the program. And as well to everybody that, you know, if you're registered online, I will send everybody a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation, as well as just some additional resources. But, you know, to kind of market our programs at the same time, this is one part of a landscape design workshop that I do. Like a 3-4 hour program that I do in the spring, all about the details of landscape design. So if you're interested in doing that workshop, just kind of think of this as just an amuse-bouche of landscape design. But anyways, let me make sure this is close so you all don't get that in your way. So I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I want to ask you all, before we get going, what is landscape design? Like, honestly, what is landscape design? And you all can put it in the chat box too. Oh, and can we get a light over in the corner? When you think of landscape design, what is landscape design? Making things beautiful with plants. Yeah. What else? Yeah, they're functional. Yeah. You're planning. Yeah, you're trying to plan something that's functional, but also looks good, right? You want to have something that looks good. You know, nothing like having a landscape that doesn't look nice and yet you have to deal with it, you know? So landscape design, I think, is just a, oops, hold on, let me turn that off. I didn't realize that annotate was on. Yep. Clear all drawings. Yes, I am recording. Hold on, let me turn off that. I thought annotate was pink off. So we don't accidentally draw into the PowerPoint slide. Low maintenance. Yeah, that's what someone put online with landscape design, low maintenance. So when I think of landscape design, you know, anything design, really, well, no, I'll say landscape design. It's problem solving. That's what it is. It's just problem solving. I like to say it's the combination of art and science to solve problems. We want to make something that's functional. It solves a problem, whether it be like drainage issues or, you know, whatever it might be. Or, you know, we just want to have a functional, fun landscape that meets our goals, that meets our objectives, whether it be something that we want low maintenance, or maybe it's something that we just want to make sure that it is like a high quality, high aesthetic, you know, say we like to put that high maintenance is. So it's really looking at how do we solve or address our problems that meets our objectives and our goals. And we want to just make sure it looks beautiful at the same time. And it's important to note that not everybody has the same preference. That's important to note. There's no such thing as one design that works for everybody, because so much of our design is really our perception, our understanding, what our goals are. So that's what makes landscape design fun, is because there's no right answer. Really, there is no right answer. It's just a matter of how do we address the problems with the resources we have. So when we think about designing landscape plans or designing a Florida-friendly landscape, you know, we start to think about landscape design and we put it in the context of Florida-friendly landscaping. So this is a program that I've also put together like with Dr. Gail Hansen. She's one of the professors on UF's campus that really specializes in landscape design. So, but as part of today's program, I want us to talk about just like basic introduction, what we're doing now, but I want us to make sure that we talk about the Florida-friendly landscaping program. And then as part of today's discussion for landscape design, I just want to introduce you to the toolbox, the designer's toolbox, a couple of the tools that you can have that allow us to think, how do we make a landscape design? How do we make something that's functional, but it works for us and make sure it looks good too? So as always, we always talk about what is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. So the FFL program is essentially, it's an integrated approach to how we're managing our yards. And aesthetics guidelines, it's not necessarily a component of it. Now, of course, if you live in an HOA and you want to be a recognized Florida Friendly landscape, you need to make sure that you're abiding by your HOA requirements or any code requirements that might exist in your community. But it's an approach to maintaining an attractive, colorful, diverse yard. It's friendly to wildlife. It's environmentally responsible. And what's really nice is it can be less work than a traditional landscape, which is really cool. But the ultimate goal of the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program is conserving water and protecting water quality. So when we think about the FFL program, you know, I mentioned it's not necessarily an aesthetic guideline, but when we're thinking about how we're designing and planning landscapes, we also think about the maintenance. How are we going to care for it? And that's really where the FFL program really comes into play. So when we're thinking about landscape design, we're thinking about what are my inputs? How is this going to be managed? So we're not going to jump into all those specific details, but it's just something that we need to be aware of, that when we're planning a design, we want something that's functional, works well, but we can manage it, and we're following best management practices. So the FFL program, we kind of look at it through the lens of these 9 principles: right plant, right place, water efficiently, fertilize appropriately, mulch, attract wildlife, manage yard pests, recycle, so recycling yard waste, reduce stormwater runoff, and protecting the waterfront. So those are the 9 principles that we think of for the FFL program. And thinking about landscape design is a critical component to that. So how many times have you all moved into a landscape where a property where you had no control over the landscape and it was just a maintenance nightmare because of the decision making that went into planning that landscape? Yeah, there's a lot of head nods. Yeah, I mean, I'm one of them, you know. It's like I moved into it, it's like, oh, who made this decision? So it's like, why don't we just plan and think about our landscapes also with maintenance in mind, such as using those FFL principles? But again, how do we make sure it works well? It looks good. So when we start thinking about landscape design, it's best to think from the end and work our way backwards. So sometimes when we think about what are design, when I would do landscape designs, I would always find that like so much of the decision making that was being done was very reiterative. So it's like I was doing it over and over and over again, thinking through problems. You make one change, you have to rethink some of those issues and how one change can affect maybe everything else in the plan. But ultimately, when we're thinking about preparing to do a landscape design or Florida-friendly design, I always like to ask, what's the big idea? What's the big idea? You know, and then think about what are those goals? What are those objectives? What do I want to achieve? You know, because this really starts to determine what does my landscape begin to look like. Think about your goals and what you would love your ideal landscape to look like and feel like and be like, you know? So I always use this as an example. When I'm thinking about my landscape plan, I think it's like, how am I using it as well? What's that function? So it's like how I think about using my landscape when I have my boys running around outside is going to be different than how I see it in 10, 15 years. So I think about what are my goals? What are my objectives? What do I want to accomplish? So much of a design is just thinking about just what's it going to be? Brainstorming, not necessarily what's it look like on a piece of paper, but what do you envision it to become? So those are the goals and outcomes. And then we end up, we're not going to go into inventory and analysis as part of today's program, but then that's the inventory and analysis is us starting to really understand what understand what our landscape is. What's existing within our landscape, and so what? What does it mean? How do those things that exist in our landscape, how can we use those to our benefit? So, for example, say you have a landscape and you're doing your analysis or your inventory, what's existing? So that can be something as sunshade conditions. That could be the soil moisture, availability, the seasonality of the plants that are already existing. So what's that start to maybe dictate when you're starting to think of maybe these environmental conditions that end up in your landscape? Your so what starts to become, how does that influence plant selection? Right plant, right place. So I have an understanding of what's happening on my landscape currently, and so what. Another thing that I always like to think about for inventory analysis is, what are the bad things? We always talk about a SWOT analysis. It's called strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And when I used to teach landscape design to students, I would always say a good designer has the ability to take a weakness and turn it to a strength, or a threat and make it an opportunity. Problem solving. So like one example is, there's some things you have no control over that we call a threat. So say in your landscape, you have all of a sudden a bad view that you have no control over. It's like, how many of you deal with that? Yeah, there's a lot of hands that just popped up. So it's like, okay, let's make this to our advantage. I have a bad view. So how about I put something that when I'm in my backyard, it blocks the view, but I'm making it something that's very ornamental, or I'm shifting someone's eye away from that view to look at something else. So you're kind of tricking the eye. Or if there's a really good view, use that as part of your design. We call it a borrowed view. So it's like, emphasize that. I mean, if you live on the marsh, you're not going to block the marsh view, right? Yeah, you're going to use that to your advantage. So you think about what's existing on the site. How can it influence your design? That's what the inventory and analysis is. It's just really just hanging out in the landscape and just trying to figure it out a little bit. And then from there, that can help direct some of your decision making. And then that's where we start to think about, okay, let's start putting design down. Let's start drawing some pictures on a piece of paper, just throwing out our ideas and thoughts. And you all probably have seen like those complete landscape designs that are like, look super beautiful and all that stuff. That's just what's submitted to make money or get a contract. There's a lot of times when like I've done landscape designs where it won't leave a piece of scratch paper or trace paper. We also call it just trash paper, because all I'm doing is just like a Sharpie marker or a pencil. I'm just drawing out ideas, and it slowly kind of refines itself. And I get to a point and I'm like, okay, that's good enough. No design is ever done, FYI. You just have a deadline. So what we want to do is, I'm not going to show you how to draw that design today, but I want to show you the tools where we can start to say, if we use these tools, we can start to put together a design that works well for us and has strong design character to it. And that's why I start to talk about the toolbox. So when we're thinking about landscape design, I break it up. This is anybody that goes to school for design learns about elements and principles. So when I think about the designer's toolbox, the elements, they are the different tools that we can use. They become the different tools that we can use. Then when we're starting to put together our landscape, we can start to put them together or use them in the design. So it starts creating a comprehensive design. But the principles become the instructions and guides on how we can use those together. So we just call it the elements and the principles of design. And once we start jumping through the elements, you'll quickly go, oh, that makes sense. And then the principles, we're just getting on I have a book in my office that goes over dozens and dozens of elements and dozens of different principles. We're going to kind of hit on some of the big key ones that we can see in landscape design. So first, I want us to kind of talk about elements of design. So some of the basic elements of design, when we're just trying to think about what are these different tools that we can start to use in our landscape, those elements include like line. That makes sense, right? One that's not on here that we're not going to talk about is point. So a single point, when you connect 2 points together, line, and when you connect multiple lines together, you create form. So that's so we're going to talk about those elements: line, form, texture, color, and visual weight. So let's go ahead and we'll jump into those, and after we go through the elements, we'll go through some of the principles. So line is one of the most basic characters of all of our landscapes. They essentially define the spaces that we're creating. When you're walking around, driving around, wherever you're at, there are lines everywhere. So lines can define forms and create patterns. They direct eye movement. They can tell people where to go. It's really cool. You can force people to go in certain directions based off of how you use these lines. But anyways, straight lines we look as very structural, geometric. Curvilinear lines have a little bit more of a naturalistic form to them. So sometimes you start to think it's like, oh, cool. Say I have a very like modern architecture building and I want something of high contrast. Maybe I'll give something very curvilinear natural lines to give a really cool contrast to the building. Or should it be the same? What objective would you want to achieve? But anyways, think about straight lines are very structural. Curved lines are very curvilinear. And we can find lines on our plant beds or hardscapes, anything, the outlines, the shapes of what plants end up looking like, their forms. So like when you look at this image that's on this screen, just think for a second and you can put it in the chat box. Where does your eye go? Yeah. Where does your eye go? Yeah. That line is forcing your eyeball to go back to the back. You are following that line with your eye. And that's a cool thing about line. It's evoking movement. So using these elements, we've always talked that like if there was a big open warehouse and I gave someone a starting point based off of how I just use just basic forms, I can control how people walk around that warehouse, open warehouse, nothing on the ground, but just how I use specific elements together, I can control how people move throughout the landscape. So, and a line is a basic element that we can use in a landscape that kind of just moves people through. It can, and it's a cool way to think about, so lines are very powerful element as part of our designs. So here's a couple other examples of line. Where do you see line in that big image on the left? Yeah. So yeah, it looks like a blue stone edger around that garden. Yeah. Where else do you see line? Say that again. Yeah, the vertical lines of the plant material. So now we're thinking about lines not just in a two-dimensional space, but we're thinking about lines in a three-dimensional space. So I see it in the edger, the edging. I see it in the plant forms. I see it in the lights. I can see it as it's like a little band in front of that wall. There's multiple lines that are existing in that garden edge. That garden edge in itself is a line, but it is constructed of multiple lines put together. So we can see lines in the other images. It's like, how are we seeing lines? Like, is it the trails? Is it those landscape beds? Whatever it might be, lines are put together in some type of layout in that design. But when we start to create and take those lines and put them together, we create form. Form is at 3 dimensions. So it's a series of lines that define spaces. It can provide scale, so how big or small something feels. And it's nice is when we think about plants, form is the most enduring part of a plant. So, but we can manipulate it through like pruning, shearing, shaping, however we want, of course. But we can see form found in plants, hardscapes, or even voids, absences, that nothing space. So when we look at this image on the right, we can see different forms. We can see forms we can see the form of the boardwalk in that big circle, but also that form in that void in between. And those forms are made of, you can look at that and then you see those lines. So it's like whenever you go back to art class, you think about when you're trying to draw something, you break it into basic shapes, right? Like a nose is a triangle, a head's an oval type of thing. Eyes are little ovals. You start to break it up in like basic shapes. And essentially that's what we're seeing in landscape design, is we're starting to take these lines to create forms and we build it up from there. So here's some other examples of forms that we can see. So forms in those different types of aloes or agave, that's kind of a unique form. You know, the form in that same image on the top left, you see form in the container, form in the steps, the edges, of that wall. In the bottom left, you see form of that turf grass void space that you've created. And on the image on the right, there's form based off of the steps, the fencing. All those different lines kind of come together. There's a line created by those steps and that form that's created by the steps that lead you, where's your eye go? Up to the house. Yeah. So form is when we start to take those lines and we piece them together just to create these different shapes. So texture relates to just like the surface quality. How do things feel or look? So like we think of texture, you think of rough or smooth or a coarse texture. So surface quality, usually texture, we can think of like a tactile or a visual. And we can use that as a way when we're thinking about texture. We see textures in plant material, hardscape surfaces, or anything in the garden we can look at and say there's different textures associated with it. And so many times it's really to the eye of the beholder and what you see. Do you want it all to be uniform in texture? Or maybe you want to have something that creates a contrast of texture. Because contrast, so if like you have a lot of fine texture and then you add something with a coarse texture into it, your eye wants to go to that coarse texture. So you can draw people's attention different ways and cool ways. But anyways, so we can use texture as one of those elements in our design and our thinking. And we're thinking about landscape design. One of the cool things is if you're in a small space and you put in fine texture plants, you can make the space feel larger. Or if you're in a small space and you put in coarse texture plants, so like coarse texture plant could be something with like a large leaf, it makes the space actually feel smaller. So we can do that in a way. It's like, okay, think about the objective of a design. Say you want a little courtyard garden. You want it to be something that like you can invite a lot of people over, and have like a dinner party and all of that stuff. It's like, cool, let's put fine texture plants in because it opens up that space a little bit more. It helps provide for more activity. But if we use like coarse texture, maybe that's going to be something that's more of like, no, I want this to be more like an intimate setting, just like me and a couple friends just kind of hang out, quiet, relax. Makes it landscape hug you a little bit. So we can use texture to our advantage. So here's some examples of texture. So we can see the fine texture on the left, very fine texture plants. And then that contrast, there's some coarse texture stone. But the fine texture complements and reinforces color and form. And then you can see on the right, the coarse texture is more dominant. So as you can see, because of just the leaf types in it. Now, of course, it's almost like when we think about texture sometimes, it really depends on what they're with. You can have sometimes something might look more of a coarse texture, but once you start pairing it with other things, it might end up looking more fine texture. So the texture can change based off of the context in which you're using it. So here's some other examples of texture. So I like the image on the left because it's like there's a lot of different textures. What becomes fine? What becomes coarse? It's tough to say sometimes. On the right, you know, we see it's a little bit easier to digest because of this large stone aggregate. That's not a Florida friendly landscape on the right, like you all probably know. But the stone creates a very coarse texture, especially in contrast with the soft texture of the grass. So color is something whenever we talk about like landscape design, it's always the joke is like, oh, anytime someone wants to ask us is like, okay, what do you want your design to be? They always say, I want it to look pretty and I want low maintenance. Those are like the two, like always the most enduring goals and outcomes, objectives that anybody has in any type of landscape. I want it to look pretty and I want it to be low maintenance. And color is such an important part of landscape design because it can create variety, it can create simplicity. It can be simplistic, it can be complex, and it can completely change how a space feels. But then we think about, okay, where do we see color? It's not just plant material. And that's usually the thing we think of is the flowers, right? When you think of gardens and color, your mind probably immediately thinks flower, right? What about the leaf colors? What about the hardscape surfaces, the benches, the accent plants, or it could be some type of ornamentation that exists in the garden? Where's the color exist? Color is everywhere. Use that to your advantage. Don't limit yourself to just using color of a flower to create color in a landscape design. So that's important to note. So we can look at color in so many different ways. So texture and color can affect the size and space, but we can use color like the image on the left. What's the first thing you saw? Yeah, the yellow grasses. Why do you see those yellow grasses first? Contrast. Yeah, it's a high contrast because of that color. It's like a very vibrant green compared to everything else. That image on the left would be like a monochromatic color scheme because it's predominantly green. But man, you're just using a slightly different green color and that, pow, it pops right out at you. So, you know, we can use that to our advantage, but if we're not careful, we can draw someone's attention to something we don't want to see either. So what about on the right? That's none of us will do this probably, but tell me what your thought about that is. It's fun. It's bold. It's bold. Some of the best designers I know will make big, bold decisions and they'll make it look really good. We're like, oh man, if any other contacts, if I said I was going to do that, shoo, you know? But think about this space. When you look at that vibrant blue color, how do you feel? It, it looks like a play space, you know, a little chill. Flip it. Flip that color choice. So all of a sudden, say instead of that blue in all that area, you know, like that yellow is that little accent color that you see. Now flip it. Make it all yellow with blue as that accent. I see a lot of ugh. So moderation. Moderation is an important part of it. And one of the most powerful colors in the garden, from my perspective, is purple. You know why? Because purple can be a warm color, it can be a cool color, you just use it however you want and it'll fit, which is really great. It's a really cool color when you're talking about color temperature, because warm colors kind of keep us moving, keep us active. You know, cool colors slow us down a little bit. And purple is that, you know, you just throw it in there, it'll be warm or it'll be cool. It just depends on what's happening around it. But we can also see that hardscape color, of course. So we can see color found in buildings, stone pavers, wood, furniture, you name it. And what's really cool is based off of what kind of colors we use and the kind of plants that we choose, we can evoke specific thoughts and feels. Like what do you want this place to be like? Like the image on the right, where do you think you're at? Southwest. Yeah, why? There's a cacti. What else? The color choice. Say it again. Yeah, no grass. The lines on the building. Yeah, exactly. So I see it from the color choice, kind of the very earthy tones. You know, the types of lines, very clean, smooth surfaces, of course. You know, but on the left, it's not quite the same. It's a very active space, I think. You know, the yellow is really bold, but what's really cool, it might be hard to see, but do you see how the landscape on the left, where does your eye go? To the table, the fireplace and the table. What do you think draws your eye there? Or one of the tools that's being done to draw your eye there? I heard it. What was it? The reds. Who said reds? I heard it a couple. So yeah, the reds. So the chairs around the table are red. The fireplace is red. Red as a contrast, using as a contrasting element with yellow will draw your eye to where you want it to go. So they're using color in such a unique space in this because like even if you look at like it looks like a clumping bamboo, it has that very like yellowy green color. So it fits that color of the entire landscape, but then you pop in some red and that creates some really cool contrast. So you're seeing that color within the hardscapes as well, and you can evoke specific thoughts, feelings, how people look, etc. So kind of the things that we looked at is like we force people to look certain directions. We call that visual weight. So we can use color or these contrasting textures or these shapes, these lines and forms to force people to look at something. Whether they know it or not, you force people to look at it. And we call that visual weight. So visual weight is just like essentially what you're looking at. Is it very prominent? Does it kind of disappear and fall away? So it's the ability to capture attention or disappear, jump out or hide. So this, or we also call this visual strength. So we kind of look at the color, the size, and the form. We create high contrast. High contrast creates high visual weight. So if you want to hide something, you don't want to put something that directs their attention towards it. So you want it to kind of like maybe hide or make someone look somewhere else by putting visual weights somewhere else. So, but anyway, so like when we're looking at this image on the right, what's the high visual weight? Say it again. Yeah, yeah, the taro elephant ear. Again, this is not in a flora-friendly landscape. It's here to express an idea. But that high contrast, it's the color, right? That color blue, even though it's a cool color, because of that high contrast, it's like, you see it. You see it. So those are the basic, some of the basic elements. Line, form, texture, color, visual weight. Those are like tools. And now we want to figure out, it's like, okay, how can we take all of these tools and how can we use these tools? It's kind of like you just went to IKEA, you bought some furniture and you open it up and you have these 5 tools that are sitting in there. And then the principles become your little manual. Like, okay, how do I actually use these? How do I actually put this all together? And some of the principles that we use include scale and proportion, balance, rhythm, unity, and emphasis. And you'll start to see that, oh, these elements and these principles, you start to see where these start to all align and coincide together. These principles, scale and proportion, balance, rhythm, unity, and emphasis. So scale and proportion, always think about scale in a landscape. How does it feel from the user? Who's in that space? That's who we're thinking about in reference to in this situation. Sometimes it can be to a building. You know, some of you have probably heard me say that I think the funniest palm tree to put in front of a typical, you know, small acreage HOA home is a Washington palm, you know, because they get huge. They get so tall. It almost looks like you just have a telephone pole in your front yard because it's not in a really cool, it's not in good scale to the home. You know, it's like, oh yeah, there's the palm fronds all the way up there. But if you're driving down Sunset Drive, it works great. You know, those aren't Washington palms, but those tall palms. You know, the scale fits a little bit better. Right? Sunset Drive, is that the one that's in Hollywood? It's like famously lined with all the palm trees. That road, whatever it's called. But I've never been there. So when we think about scale and proportion, scale, it's the size or the physical dimensions of a space. And the proportion is relative to the adjacent objects, typically to, oh, Sunset Boulevard. Thank you. Yeah. So, so when we're thinking about landscape design, we're thinking about scale and proportion. We're thinking about that human body. So scale is like the size of the spaces, proportion is relative to the other objects around it. All right. But usually we're thinking about from the space of the user in garden design. So we can see scale and proportion of plants. How do plants have that scale and proportion to one another? So we can look at the size and scale of individual plants or to masses of plants, so use of a lot of plants together. So like on the image to the left, when you think about scale and proportion, think about the size of the space. How do you feel walking through there? Yeah, you're a little cramped. Intimate. I know. It's so funny. In design, we have words that we use. So when we say intimate, that means we're cramped. Yeah. But it's like, but it's funny because in some situations, having that cramped feeling, you may want. You know, I think of like Willy Wonka when they go into the tiny room, they're all crammed in, and then they open up the door, and it's all of a sudden every kid's dream is the room where you can eat all the candy. You know, so it's like that scale is like really tight and uncomfortable, but then it like opens up, and all of a sudden it has a completely different feel. It's not like you just walk into, it's like, oh, this is a cool room, but they create almost in that situation a level of uncomfort, which makes that space feel even better. So it's like you're tricking the mind in in these spaces. But sometimes in these intimate, more cramped spaces, kind of like what we see in like an entry of a home, assuming it's not like you're not having to fight through things to get to the front door, it actually can slow it down. So say you're in a city, things are moving. Bam, 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 bam. You're walking down New York City and it's like, oh man, I need to slow down a little bit. You walk into this space, it forces you to slow down. It kind of stops time a little bit. And by doing that, you're creating this scale in such a way where people feel a little bit more, it's like a hug to a certain extent. So, but you have to be careful because like last night during our Master Gardener volunteer training, we're talking about, weeping willow right along a sidewalk. That'd be a horrible idea because then you're like getting stuck in all the branches as you try to walk. But anyways, so we can look at how plants provide scale and proportion. Yeah, someone said you need to duck to get inside the door. That's very true because I would not have put that Japanese maple on the left side because yeah, you did have to duck underneath it. But we also can see it in hardscapes. Or so, again, remember closely it's relative to the human body for function, psychological comfort. So the image on the left, they're using these much larger flagstones. So it actually makes you feel like you shrunk down a little bit, I think, so that kind of creates a space. It's like maybe it's a little bit slower space, but on the right side, you see a lot of that fine texture that's being used within that gravel. So that might make that space feel a little bit bigger. Remember how we talked about textures with like leaf plant material? Coarse texture can kind of maybe bring things in a little bit. Fine texture might be able to even bring some things out a little bit. So we're seeing this in our hardscapes material. We're also seeing it in voids. Remember that empty space, how we're using those forms. So look at the space on the left compared to the right. Vertical elements are part of that. So that fence on the left side of this, on the left side, kind of restricts your view. So it makes it come in a little bit more, that vertical element. But on the right, since you can actually see a little bit more, that view shed what we call it, opens up, makes you breathe a little bit more, just opens up that view. Cramped, intimate, not intimate. Cramped, not cramped. And then the next principle is balance. So balance really talks about like that visual weight. You know, we have things of different visual weight. Imagine if your eyeball is looking at it. Like, it's funny because if there is heavy visual weight, have you ever noticed that you start to get off kilter sometimes when you're walking next to like a big building, like vertigo? It's kind of like such heavy vertical weight or that visual weight. So that balance almost seems off balance. I joke about this because when I go to like visit my brother in New York City, it's like I get vertigo because I feel like you have this huge building on your side, and then just even though it's the road, you're just like walking a little crooked because the visual weight, that balance kind of throws you off a little bit. But you can use that to your advantage. Maybe if a building or a structure has a really high visual weight, maybe you want to balance it out by taking weight away, make it seem like less intrusive. So maybe it makes that space feel a little balanced between heavy visual weight and low visual weight. Or maybe you want all low visual weight or all high visual weight. It can change how you feel in that design. So it's a balance and equal mass and it's actual or visual about like a central axis or, you know, just in that space. So we can use shape, color, texture, lines, forms, all of that stuff that we talked about to kind of put in and think about visual weight or that balance, sorry, of a space. This one is, you know, always easy for us to think about. Symmetry. Symmetry creates what we call order in a design. When we're all doing like our first designs, we usually find that most people will stick to something that might be more symmetrical because there's balance, there's structure, there's order that's created. There's a sense of understanding. So what's happening on one side is happening on the other. And it's like you can use that to your advantage. So you can see these images. The one on the left is mostly symmetrical. The pool is a little asymmetrical, but that's okay. But you can definitely see, you know, in that design, very strong geometric forms are usually, not always, usually attributed with symmetrical landscapes. Think about formal gardens. Strong symmetries, unless you're looking in the details of your not gardens, of course. Strong symmetries are typically associated with those. Strong geometric lines and forms are used. You know, but you can see that from a landscape plan, or you can see it's like certain elements or certain parts of a garden. So you can see the symmetry in this walkway on the right. The gate is kind of that sidewalk, that line is leading you through that gate. And along that walkway is a symmetry of plant material, how the hardscape is used, etc. But then you have asymmetrical balance, purposely making things not the same. So it's considered more informal. So it's an informal balance by visual mass. Of non-equivalent form, size, color, and texture. So essentially, you're purposely making it not the same. So, but it can be in such a cool way. So look at that building on the right. What kind of texture would you call that? Would it be a fine texture, or do you think that's a coarse texture? Kind of like a fine, yeah. What about the color? Pretty bold. Yeah, that's a really bold color. So that really helps soften the space with the left side. Thinking about that balance, that asymmetry by bringing in that green. That landscape helps balance out that color and kind of creates an asymmetrical feel to a landscape. So asymmetrical landscapes are typically very informal. You're using a lot more of the curvilinear lines and forms that kind of creates that naturalistic feel. Then we also have rhythm. When we see rhythm, whoever thought the landscape could be musical? It's cool. So rhythm, it's just repetition. How are we seeing repetition? But you have to be so careful with repetition in a landscape. You really have to. So when looking at this image, where are you seeing repetition? Yeah, the walkway. You see grass. It's like grass, paver, grass, paver, grass, paver, grass, paver. You're not necessarily, you see some repetition in the plant material, more so the trees, but thinking about the elements, where is that taking you? Where do you want to walk? Straight back. It's hard to see, but what's it leading your eye to? Visual weight. There's a tree. There's a tree sitting in there, and it's surrounded by gravel. The idea is you have this repetition. Repetition, that rhythm evokes movement. Mm, mm, just like your steps. It evokes movement, but this terminates at something with heavy visual weight. So it's wanting you to draw you in and then stop. It wants you, it's like, ooh. So when I was talking about, like, I can put you in a warehouse and I can walk you or lead you around a warehouse with nothing but like single elements hidden through it. It could literally just be using something of high visual weight and just assuming of lines that I can force you to walk one direction. You get to that point, I can force you to walk another direction. Yeah, you can. Yeah. This is not a hopscotch garden. So, but yeah, you can walk on that grass. So, a great example of where we can kind of see this rhythm and visual weight, a little bit like one that I always think of is the Aesop's gardens at the Gardens of Versailles. It's kind of like they're using visual weight and certain statues hidden through this like little garden labyrinth that draw you through the garden at different ways. So, but we see rhythm in all sorts of things. Form of plant material. Is it being pruned, or you're using it could be completely different types of plants, but if they have the same form, you can have that rhythm in the form of plants. It can be within the color changing that we see on plant material. It can be material, that could be voids, it can be spaces. All those elements we can use in certain ways to create rhythm in a landscape. And what I like about the rhythm that we see in that flower in the center is the rhythm is created by the gradient. It's not necessarily saying it's one, like music, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You're expecting, it's like you're seeing that it's changing, and you know that it's changing, and you can anticipate that pattern of change, not necessarily repetition. So you're seeing a rhythm, even how that gradient can exist. But it's really important to know that repetition can sometimes be too much. You have to balance it. So yeah, so you have to be very careful. I really love that walkway on the left. You anticipate, you see that there's rhythm associated with it. It looks like Van Gogh became a landscape designer, but I also feel like I'd fall over when I'd be walking that sidewalk. But you can see rhythm in hardscapes as well. Remember, it's not just the plant material, it's every single part of our landscapes. Every single part is what design we can put these elements and principles into. So now we want to talk about unity, because I'm running out of time. Unity is when we start to think about similar characteristics and how they're used throughout a design to kind of create uniformity or that unity across a design. So when you're looking at this image, what are you seeing? What's the unifying factor that exists with it? Round, circle. Yeah, it's like, where do you see the circles? Oh, that window. The seats, the hammock. Yeah, because like the hammock, it's great. It's because it's not a full circle, but your mind sees that circle because of just that arc, that half that arc. Because that unity is so strong in that image, your mind fills the gaps, which is really cool. So there's the circular steps, the circular patio area, the sphere seats. So it's everywhere. But you can see that again, hardscape material. You can see it in plant material. So it can be, you know, unity in types of color. It could be unity in types of plant forms. We can see it unity in hardscapes and how it's being used. So hardscapes you can use as kind of like series of lines and forms, a series of lines to create these forms, and you can use those hardscape material to kind of help dictate that unity amongst the landscape. But there's also variety. It's important to create contrast. Too much rhythm, it kind of gets monotonous. If the unity is a little overwhelming, it gets monotonous and it gets a little chaotic. You need to allow people to rest when looking at a landscape. You need to create visual rest or even like a visual rest. Take someone's eye somewhere to something that's like a contrast, allow them to slow down. Because there are some times when you get to a landscape where the unity is too strong, the rhythm is too strong, it's used way too much, and all of a sudden it's like you got a headache because your mind is like ding, 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 like all over the place. So it's nice to have that spot to make the user stop and rest, calm them down. And that's a great idea because all you're doing is when you create that contrast, maybe it's that space that you want them to go. Move them around the landscape, force them to stop with that contrast. And that's when we think about things like emphasis, emphasize things, focal points. What's the first thing you saw in this image? The palm. Yeah, it's using symmetry. Obviously, it directs you to that. It is the determinate point of that line in that form. Bing. That's what you want people to go to. You see that right below it, there's that little tiny fountain. That's a spot where it's like, I want you to come here and I want you to stop, chill, hang out a little bit. And it's hard to see, but there's actually benches on each side. So it's like pull you in, make you stop, make you sit, make you hang out a little bit. Don't walk through the garden, spend time here, you know. But it's really cool is if you want people to like scurry, move along, you know, rhythm, push them out, and then move them where you want them to be, and then make them stop. So you can do emphasis in a lot of different things like specimen plants. So looking at different plant material that kind of catches the eye, essentially it's a focal point. It's a plant that kind of breaks the monotony of the landscape in such a way where it grabs their eye. So attract attention through contrasting plant material, and you can do that through different garden elements like planters. You can do it through sculptures, texture changes, whatever it might be. So the emphasis or focal points of gardens can be great to your advantage because then you're using it to break monotony and provide a space for people to rest, or you want them to look at something. So those are the elements and principles of design. So the elements, remember, those are the tools that you have available to you. Line, form, texture, color, visual weight, and then we just kind of put them together in cool ways, and those ways are the principles. And the principles are just those guides, those terms that we used, you know, the symmetry, unity, you know, rhythm. We're starting to piece these all together because then all of a sudden that's going to be what holds the design together and makes it more of a usable, better space. So when you start thinking about your landscape and you got a piece of paper, just draw out some ideas. What do you want people to feel? Do you want it to be formal? Do you want it to be informal? What kind of lines do you want people to, or what kind of lines are you going to then have to have? Do you want people to be able to move through it? Do you want it to be cramped? You know, what do you want to achieve? And then you use these to help create the outcome and goal of your landscape. And then you just put these together however you think works best to achieve your goal. And guess what? It's not always going to work. You might, well, that didn't work. And you can go back and make changes later. You know, that's always cool. But anyways, so today we talked a little bit about design. We talked a little about the FFL program because remember, when we're thinking about design, we need to think about maintenance. You know, you still have to take care of it. And when we talk about inventory analysis, right plant, right place is as a result of inventory and analysis. So we actually are starting to thinking about plant selection, which I kind of usually do at the end of a design. Like I'll think of some plants as I'm designing, but ultimately my final plant decisions are like one of the last things I end up doing because I'm just trying to think, you know, what do people need to see? So sometimes I think about right plant, right place, but part of that might be I need to have a plant that's upright and has bright red foliage. That becomes another little characteristic I need as part of the design for right plant, right place. Might not necessarily environmental conditions, but it might be something as like, what kind of plant can help achieve this goal? You know, and then even like we're talking about hardscapes, right hardscape, right place. Same type of thing is like, what textures do you need? So a lot of those things you start to visually interact with it in your mind as part of that design, and you make changes and rearrange and move and make things. And remember, no design is ever done. You just have a deadline. So you have to force yourself to stop eventually. But anyways, so here's my contact info. And again, I will provide everybody a copy of the PDF today, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as some additional EDIS publications from UF that actually goes into some details with some of this information. So you can kind of look at it, and then also be on the lookout in the spring. I do that landscape design workshop where we actually do designs and kind of play around more. So anyways, any questions? Now is the time for questions. That's the best way to say. So any questions you can put into the chat box, and I'll make sure I relay any questions that come out from the audience so everyone online can hear. Y'all now feel like professional designers? Yeah. What is the most important element that we need to make sure that we have? Otherwise, we will have problems. Honestly, it's one that we didn't even talk about. If I'd say the most important element is point. Like I know at the very beginning I mentioned point, but without point, you don't have line, you don't have form, you don't have voids. There's no relationship. You can't have emphasis. It is the most rudimentary thing that we can think of. It's as simple as a pencil, just putting a dot on a piece of paper. That's the base. Without that, we have nothing. So that's, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's great. So that's great. So what you're, yeah, so in this situation, so it was mentioned is there is a drain field, but it's at the front of your house. So it's like on the street side, but it's like where you have to have it as part of the septic systems. So it's raised up. Well, it's in your front yard compared to your backyard. Yeah, so the so what ends up happening is, this is a great example I mentioned, is like that SWOT analysis, because you have that septic area where it's kind of raised. It's like in some, like you're driving across the state and you'll see just that septic just like raised because it has to be. Right. And this is what I think is a great example of where you have this raised area where you can do minimal to it because of what it is, like a septic system. This is where I think it's one of those moments where you're taking a weakness and you're turning it into a strength. So which would typically be considered a point of like, can we just hide it? It's like, well, no, how about we make it so walk up, use the top of it, and it can become like a view shed that you create. So it has a level of hierarchy. So all of a sudden it becomes a strength of that design. So that's a great example of taking what might be a weakness and turn it into a strength. And I do have one question that came in here. It is, oh, will I also be providing the recording? Yes. Oh, thanks, Bobby. Yeah, the recording of this presentation goes on YouTube, and that goes out. And the other question I had was how to balance the design with the client's desires and wants. Oh, that's always a hard thing. So designing for ourselves is easy. Designing with clients, it can be difficult. So sometimes it really, there's a couple things that we have to think about when we're considering, like, say someone hires us for a design. We have to consider budget. What's realistic within that budget? We got to think about what are their maintenance needs? What can they do? Are they hiring somebody? Are they going to be doing it themselves? And then also, it's part of that inventory and analysis is learning what's the capacity of that client. What can they do? And then also just a certain level of transparency. It's like, if you want this, this is what's going to be required in order to make this successful. Are they willing to make it successful? And then also, when you start to think about budget, what can be afforded? And it can also sometimes be design. It can be difficult because as a designer, we may have what we consider like, oh, this is a good design. But then the client's like, well, no, I don't like that. Maybe I want this. It's like, how do you create balance between that when they don't always align? And that's hard. That honestly can be hard to do. So it's a good way to like communicate, do different types of visual communication. If possible, that's like sometimes when we do what we call sections or perspectives. So it's like the renderings, the drawings, the sketches, trying to show what it will look like and feel like before you build it based off of the plan, because sometimes it can be very hard for people to look at a site plan and then see how that feels, because scale is really hard to interpret on a plan. Proportion, rhythm, unity is very hard to see. So we do those different visual exercises to communicate visually to show how a space can feel. And sometimes we have to do those to kind of show this is what it's going to kind of look like based off of what you would want. Maybe here's like a balance between what we recommend and what you want, and maybe that becomes kind of what you do. And there's some other details and nuances, because you have to be careful, because a client hires you to do a design and you can't just constantly just be reworking a design, because then you get stuck constantly with that client and then you're not making money. So sometimes you have to think, we're going to put the design, we'll meet, we'll look at draft concepts and we'll put it together and start building it. And then they can have one revision of the final plan, and then you can all talk and then you rework it. But then any other revision that they have to do part after that, they have to pay an additional fee to. So you have that built into your contract to kind of say, this is the expectation. Because I do know in some situations where it was actually really bad, where the designer has fired the client. Yeah, and that happens because they're like, this just is not working. This is not working. And that's an unfortunate thing. It's rare, but it happens. And obviously there are other times when the client fires the designer. So, and you don't, as a designer, you don't want to get fired. So you're trying to think is like, how do we balance these expectations and needs? And creating that transparency can help, but it's not always easy. It really is not easy when you're working directly with a client. So, especially if they already know what they want, it's like, okay, then what am I, what am I doing? So that's a wonderful question. Any other questions? Is there any software I recommend? Oh, thanks for coming. So there is some software, but the thing is, it's just like a lot of landscape design software is not cheap, which really stinks. So like Photoshop is a common one. Google SketchUp is another one. I think they call it something different now. But and there are some other, like one that I'll use sometimes is like in AutoCAD. It's like I'll sketch everything out and I just do everything on paper. And then like say I'm doing a final plan, I'll have it on, and I just want plant quantities. There's a plugin that I use on AutoCAD called Land Effects, where I can do plant material schedule, irrigation calculations. It kind of just helps speed me along. But when I want things to look really nice, usually I'll do some type of photo rendering, like either hand drawing, or I will do some like graphic things with like Photoshop or anything like that, or other photo editing software. So yeah. And that's the thing, it's like it's really hard to find free software to accomplish these things. And then sometimes you can buy things like, oh, maybe a $50 subscription a year, but it's limited in its capacity. But if you're just trying to do something for yourself, I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would just do the sketch it out, draw it out, Lindsay and I last week were walking around with a can of spray paint, you know, just spraying grass and just talking about it. So, I mean, it could be as simple or as crude as you want it to be. So, but yeah, I would think about if you're wanting to do professional services, think about a nice software. And that's part of budgetary planning, as part of your overhead costs. And when you're doing your contracts and estimations and stuff like that, make sure it's covered in that so you recoup that cost. Yeah. And if anybody online or here, if you have any specific questions about professional practice recommendations, feel free to reach out to me. Cool. All right. A little after 11. Thank you all. So let me turn off this. Stop recording.